Hans van Tilburg returned again for what is almost an annual visit to EAH. The title of Hans' talk, Ticking Time Bombs? Sunken ships of World War II or potentially polluting wrecks of World War II. Tens of thousands of shipwrecks were left in the northern Atlantic and South Pacific Oceans after World War II. It is estimated up to 20 million tons of oil remain in these wrecks. Hans started his talk at the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor, which still retains its fuel oil. Because the Arizona is a national memorial with thousands of visitors means assessing the risks must be done, so it has been a leader in developing methods to document the assessments. Hans discussed various country and international databases for the wrecks, but most locations are only estimates because exact locations were not documented at the time of the wreck. Hans provides the historical background for a number of wrecks, mitigations, and assessments. Hans is hopeful that new international efforts will lead to better mitigation in the future.
Well, welcome everybody. It is Friday, February 16th. Thank you very much for attending our presentation this afternoon. My name is Kanan. I'm the president of EAH.
They didn't have a speaker 100 years or 90 years ago. And their Charles Hume, who was the chairman, program chair, talked about the big repair basin under construction at Pearl Harbor. Bids for the work opened in Washington, 1933. The low bidder with the offer was $2,735,000, and that was Hawaiian dredging. And this lists off the size of basically the piers that they're talking about. And this is, they called it an E because it was 3 piers that they built out. And I measured this on Google, and the lengths agree with what's stated in the bulletin.
Friday, we are holding a luncheon at the Walkley Country Club for Frank to honor his nomination for the Lifetime Achievement Award winner. We are sponsoring the speaker, Karen Meach, for the event. She's going to be the guest speaker. She's been a guest speaker for us in the past. She's done our the last one she did was the Oumuamua visitor from an interstellar visitor. So she did that the last time she was here. She's a very gifted and very accredited speaker, you know, giving TED Talks. Okay, the humor man's here.
Welcome to the EAH Humor Forum. Today we're going to need to visualize again. It's an advertising poster I saw which read, "As a kid, did you ever knock on people's doors and run away before they could answer? Well, guess what? We are hiring." It's a poster of UPS and a driver. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, well, I'm going to turn it right back to you, Mac. You're the current monthly chair.
It is my pleasure and my heavy responsibility to introduce Hans van Tilburg, PhD, diver, sailor, archaeologist, historian, author, instructor, consultant to UNESCO, Pacific Maritime Heritage Coordinator for NOAA, as well as a member of the International Committee on Underwater Cultural Heritage. See, did I miss anything? Oh, did I mention twice runner-up for the Toshiro Makoni lookalike contest? And all this despite his extreme youth. So, in the past, he has brought us stories of dire disasters at sea, of the brave and courageous men and women who challenged the golden goddess. the sea. Today, he brings us a story of an impending danger that now lurks beneath the waves. And just when you thought it might be safe to go back in the water again. No, it's not the creature from the dark lagoon or the after bilges. It's man's creation. Dr. Van Tilburg, tell us about this monster.
That is, of course, our backyard, the Arizona burning after the attack. And the superstructure and everything that was left on there that was taken off after the attack, of course. And I do have to say that I'm representing my own, kind of knowledge and expertise as a historian or archaeologist, and not here on behalf of any particular government agency, which may or may not enjoy the remarks. Yeah, this has been a coming issue for a while, and there have been interesting updates. I am not an expert in any way in this per se. I'm involved with issues like this because I'm a maritime archaeologist and historian, and we overlap in our management initiatives with potentially polluting vessels. But I'm here to share, what little knowledge I have with you on the topic. But there are people that know this much better, of course. I came into the topic naturally by being involved with the USS Arizona from the archaeological perspective, the historical side, but the Arizona site itself has been such a wealth of data and experimentation in my field in maritime archaeology that it's well to note that a number of studies are continuing on the structure of this complex battleship as it deteriorates over time, the metallurgy, the oil analysis within the holds, and the Park Service and the Navy are continuing with those studies. So it's really quite a wealth of data for this field and for the issue of the oil that's inside, which we would estimate to be, remember the ship was topped up before the attack, but then burned for 3 days. So what's left? It's hard to say, maybe 500,000 gallons of bunker C crude oil. And the question is often, well, why don't you just, tap into those bunkers and remove the oil? And that's a fair question from the public, but it would be incredibly invasive because the site is a war grave and a memorial, and it's a battleship, we remind the public. Those bunkers are deep inside the ship behind, armor plate, and it would be incredibly invasive to go in there and try to do that. So these are the studies that are looking at the potential for the oil are involved in the entire structure and what's happening with the ship over time, and take into account its special status and for heritage and for tourism and as a war grave. But I will say for my field, for maritime archaeology, the basic survey methods that we've used for so many years and are only changing now because of advancing technology, those were developed on the Arizona back in the early 80s by the Park Service. The basic documentation processes we've used for so many years that shaped our field. So along these lines, we are involved with wanting to understand the scale of potentially polluting sites in the oceans and put together a database called RUST, NOAA's RUST database, Remediation of Undersea Threats. And ultimately, this came to some 30,000 plus entries. 20,000 or so are vessels. They're not all vessels, of course. As a larger database, which we then prioritized into a specific study some years later. So we do have this RUST database at NOAA. And the person that headed that project, though, passed away a number of years ago. So we're trying to decide how to advance this maintaining this database, in the coming years. But you can see, even for our federal waters, how impressive that list is for these types of sites. And some of it is World War II, like on the East Coast, or the Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic, of course, stretched all the way across the Atlantic to the British Isles and Europe. But our portion along the East Coast also had a number of potentially polluted wrecks from those losses of convoys. 3,500 merchant ships lost in the Atlantic. And some of those are on our coasts. In 2013, we then looked at the entire database and distilled out a report on the potentially risk assessment for potentially polluting vessels in US waters, where we took about 87 of those highest priority wrecks and drafted them up in the report in a risk assessment. So that's what that report is. It's publicly available. It's online. But like I say, it was 2013, so it's a number of years ago. There hasn't been a follow-up report on it. And you can see we're also focused, rightfully so, on federal waters and our EEZ. And those are the zones in the Pacific and of course across the continent of mainland. And by far, the majority of vessel losses that are potentially polluting wrecks are lost by the cause of war and combat.
The 30,000 number that was up there,
Yeah,
goes back to, sailing ships and things like that, or?
all types of undersea threats. It could be, disposal sites, unused pipelines, whatever. Only a portion of those are vessels. And this talk, of course, we're only talking about a portion of those vessels, World War II vessels. But our database, our NOAA database that we did in 2013, just takes any type of vessel, World War II or commercial or otherwise. What are the potentially polluting priority sites, and pulls out 87 of those for assessment. This is an example of the threats assessment matrix. And you can see there are a number of different factors involved. The nature of the pollution or cargo, the operational factors, as in the ship construction, the environmental factors, the sensitivity of ecosystem areas nearby, some socioeconomic criteria. But right at the top, we're talking about potentially polluting vessels and undersea threats is A1, A2, oil volume, oil type, oil cargo. That's not to say that there aren't a host of other potentially hazardous materials on vessels, right? So that's how we came to categorize the threat and select the 87 from our waters. This is simply an example of the various types of domestic or US remediation projects stretching back to 1991. But remember, this is from the 2013 report, so this only runs up through 2011. But you can see a number of vessels that, and the project year of the mitigation efforts, the location, which state it's in, the action of partial removal or removal, and the cargo or bunker type. HFO is heavy fuel oils. So that's the most of what we have there. You might note in 2001, there's the Hime Maru in Hawaii, partial removal of 665 barrels of diesel at a depth of 2,000 feet. So that's the deepest domestic one we had to that date of 2013 when the report came out. Most of the depths are, 70, 100 feet, 160 feet. 900 feet, that's pretty impressive. The Montebello, partial removal of the tanker off of California. That was a wartime loss, 1941, torpedo attack. And then by comparison, and too small to read here, is the international list of the same sort of thing, stretching back to the 60s up through 2011. Name of vessel, nation, action, removal, and most of those cargoes are heavy fuel oils or diesel. You might notice in the depth column, there's one called out for Spain at 15,000 feet. I'm not really sure of that. I was doing some background checking on that one. That was a commercial tanker that broke in half. They towed the bow out to deep water and dropped it in 15,000 feet. The stern is in shallow water, 2,000 feet, I think. I'm not sure which they're referring to there, but I don't know of any remediation at 15,000 feet, frankly. That's extremely deep. One example that we point to when we do talk about this topic is something that the Navy did in the South Pacific at Ulithi Atoll, which was, a staging area in the closing days of World War II and the amphibious campaign across the Pacific, was the remediation of the Mississmewa, the tanker Mississmewa, which was sunk in combat in the lagoon, and the MDSU-1, the Mudsuit unit, Marine Diving and Salvage unit, from Pearl Harbor here as a training exercise, I believe it was, went down there and hot tapped into the cargo spaces of the Mississmewa and removed that oil, which was definitely an environmental threat in that sensitive and shallow lagoon. And there's a report available online about that and about the extensive logistics that go along with a project like that. The dive barges, the dive support, the technology to assess, where the cargo is going to be in the ship, and then to invasively tap into that cargo and remove it. And then what do you do with the cargo? You have another barge there to receive the cargo and take it somewhere else. So yeah, it's an impressive amount of work that would go into doing something. It's no easy feat to do that and not risk another oil spill on the bottom at the same time. In American Samoa, we had the same sort of situation with the USS Chehalis, which was a tanker during the war, but after the war, it was in Pongo Harbor at the fuel dock. Something caught fire, they couldn't extinguish the fires, so they cut the lines, pushed the tanker out into the harbor where it exploded, and unfortunately took some lives with it. Sank to the bottom of Pongo Harbor, where she's been over on her side for a number of years, and passing storms would cause some of that aviation gas to kind of burp up from the ship and cause a problem. So eventually the diving and salvage unit did the same thing. Hot tapped the cargo out of the Chehalis in 2011. But, those are great individual examples, and even the domestic or international mitigation efforts are wonderful, but the scale of the potential threat from a massive amphibious and naval and an army and combined forces campaign in the Pacific is still hard to conceive. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of vessels lost. This is simply a map of the campaign for World War II from the Central Pacific westwards into Southeast Asia and up to Japan. There isn't any single worldwide database for vessel losses, really. I mean, individual countries have sort of pursued this. We have a database for vessels lost in our waters that NOAA is responsible for, particularly the sanctuary program. This is an example of the Navy's database for US Navy vessels and aircraft lost around the world. Some 3,000, more than 3,000 ships, 15,000 aircraft. And of course, the majority of those remain the sovereign property and territory of the United States, as is spelled out in the Sunken Military Craft Act, which takes into account previous legislation. Those are American ships, even when they're sunk on the bottom. Even the aircraft are sunken military vessels and seen as sovereign American property. So this isn't the detailed database. That database, of course, is the Navy's, the DOD's. But if you have a reason to query it, you contact the Naval History and Heritage Command, and they'll kind of have the appropriate non-disclosure agreements and things like that, because this is not a public database. Something else we look at for World War II is in the post-war years, and this is an example of a reprint of the 1947 report, Japanese naval and merchant shipping losses during World War II from all causes. And that's a pretty impressive database. Now, as in a similar manner to many of the Navy's own records in just the post-war years, nobody was expecting that someone was going to go back and want to find the exact positions of lots of these things. And they didn't have the GPS anyway, so the positions are pretty vague. They're not confirmed in any way, but it is a place to start to understand the scope of the threat and the resource. One NGO that has attempted to pull together regional and global data on potentially polluting vessels is the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environmental Program, or SPREP. This is a little dated as well. This work goes back to 2010, 2013. So it's a little dated, but they wanted to begin to address the scale of the issue and have tallied up a grand total of 857 potentially polluting wrecks in the Pacific. And though those are ones in different countries' EEZs, you can see kind of the scope in Southeast Asia for those areas, and shipwrecks in the Pacific by country of origin. And the blue section of pie are the Japanese shipwrecks. That's not surprising. That's how the war was fought. This is their graphic they put together a number of years ago globally, trying to estimate the potential threat. 2.5 to 20 million tons, perhaps, of oil in sunken vessels worldwide. I've seen, more recent estimates of 4 million tons, 5 million tons, maybe somewhere in there. That's a pretty broad range, 2.5 to 20 million. But just to understand what that means, Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico, that was 1.1 million tons that spilled. So you're talking something multiples beyond that over time. So all that, was occurring and information was put together earlier, a decade or more earlier. But what also brought this topic into more recent focus in 2016, 2015, 16, 17, is the realization of what was happening with the World War II shipwrecks in Southeast Asia. And this is one example of one newspaper article from that time, it's February 2018, I think it is, scouring the deep for old steel. Because there is illegal plunder and salvage of World War II vessels for their steel by agents acting in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And often the companies are flagged in some other country, but maybe owned by Chinese shipyards, and it's taken to scrap yards, and it's not exactly always legal, but enforcement is the big issue. I think people really first came to be aware of this when there was a British film team and a crew going to pay their annual respects at one of the losses of the British ships in the Battle of Java. And they arrived on site, the divers went to the bottom and said, the ship's not here anymore. And they were ready to put the lays on the water. And that's pretty shocking.
Yeah.
One of the reasons is that these ships were all forged in a pre-nuclear age before the atomic testing in the Pacific. So the steel that went into building them has a very low background radioactive signature. Nobody can forge steel like that anymore. We're a post-nuclear testing age. But if you want to build sensitive scientific instruments and medical instruments that are used in cancer studies, for instance, this type of low radiation steel is very important. It raises the cost of the salvage. It makes it economically viable. This is not something that Indonesia would say is they would allow. They don't allow it. But many of those World War II ships are also not Indonesian ships. Those are British ships and Dutch ships and French ships and Australian ships and US ships and submarines that have begun to vanish. So just recently, last December, UNESCO pulled together a meeting that was held in Jakarta to address this topic, World War shipwrecks in Southeast Asia, threats of marine pollution and looting. And it's an interesting meeting, and for some reason I was invited to be one of the talking experts. I guess I got fooled that way, right? It was an honor to go and to accept their kind invitation. And the idea was to bring in some content speakers to talk about the scope of the issue and the nature of the wrecks, and then also to have some representatives from various countries in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, which is Malaysia and Vietnam and Philippines, etc. And to promote a kind of a non-binding letter of intent for those representatives to sign, saying, we're going to begin to address this issue in some way. So the meeting was successful, and here we are looking rather casual, which is the nature of some of these UNESCO meetings, which is very nice. And it was the first time I got to go to Indonesia, so I enjoyed that. And I'm standing next to my friend Nia Ridwan, who works for the Indonesian Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Ministry of Fisheries, and also does the underwater cultural heritage for Indonesia. and a number of other, really noted people in the field, Bobby Oraneda from the Philippines, et cetera, and Sven from Belgium, and then our UNESCO liaison there to my right. So this is a slide that I'm showing you from Nia Ridwan's presentation at the UNESCO meeting, because these presentations are public. And so I credit her. This is her slide. The location of World War II shipwrecks and their research in Indonesia, which is ongoing. And of course, they saw a lot of fierce battles around the Malaccan Straits and the Java Sea, et cetera. And it's not deep waters like we have either. This is continental shelf area. So you're looking at things that are, 100, 200, 300 feet down, rather than thousands and thousands of feet. And the threat from the oil is there because the vessel sank with it. But if the salvage is happening, then if someone's going to illegally start grappling the steel out of there, that oil is going to be coming up. And it's going to hit their beaches. It's a very important issue for Indonesia. And not only that, this is not something we always think about. Although I used to, because I lived directly on the San Andreas Fault for a number of years, my wife and I. But Indonesia is the rim of fire. It's the place for earthquakes and volcanoes. And so when they think long-term of issues like this, threats from shipwrecks underwater and their oil, they take into account the number of earthquakes they have and will have. I thought that was very interesting. They're very aware of the metal scavenging issue. They have had talks with various navies, including folks from Naval History and Heritage Command at the Washington Navy Shipyard. And, they don't allow it. They don't want to allow it. But Indonesia is a large area, very large, with 14,000 islands. They don't exactly have the infrastructure capacity for enforcement over what is a wreck from someone else's navy. But they do outreach to their own public in Indonesia on what the history of the war is and what the threat is from those ships. And this is Nia's slide of some of that outreach. It's quite impressive, given the size of their staff for addressing underwater cultural heritage. And they do a number of publications as well on World War II shipwrecks, including the potential for undersea threats to the ecosystem. So we were all very impressed by that at this UNESCO meeting in Jakarta. And in fact, the next meeting for the Asia Pacific Regional Conference on Underwater Cultural Heritage, I can put that in an acronym if you guys want to, will be in Bali in 2026. So there is a plus side to being a maritime archaeologist. It'll be hosted by Indonesia. We are interested in what the potential is for the U.S. vessels there. When I say I can't really speak for Navy History and Heritage Command, but the Navy did go out and do a cooperative project to assess the potential impacts to this vessel, in particular, the USS Huston, which is a cruiser that was lost during the war and is within diveable depths. And there were reports that people were beginning to salvage artifacts to damage the hull of the ship. And, I don't know what their assessment is for the potential of the fuel oils on board, but there was a joint investigation done by an Indonesian Navy and the US Navy in 2014. And so that report is also available online to understand the Navy's perspective on this issue. And then what's interesting is that there are a number of NGOs and nonprofits who are beginning to focus on this topic, regionally, perhaps even globally. And a colleague of mine, Dr. Matt Carter, who is from the Pacific, his company is called the Major Projects Foundation. And he's been studying this issue and is launching a major survey of potentially polluting wrecks. And he's been tapping into satellite data to track the slick outlines surrounding the known wreck site positions. And here you can see color-coded areas where slicks from World War II vessels are coming up in Southeast Asia. And this is his slide again from this presentation that he gave at the UNESCO meeting. So pretty fascinating technology which can begin to be applied to find these slicks and perhaps even locate polluting vessels that haven't been located or ground truthed, by maritime archaeologists. Do it this way. There is a larger emerging approach to address the issue of potentially polluting wrecks. I'm happy to say, and I learned more about this when Michael Brennan, who is the chief editor for this pending publication, Threats to Our Ocean Heritage, Potentially Polluting Wrecks, was the other archaeologist on a recent expedition we did. We had the privilege of going on the Nautilus, Bob Ballard's vessel for the Ocean Exploration Trust. And we went to look at the Midway battlefield. So Mike Brennan and I were the two archaeologists on the ship. I got to go on board while many of the others collaborated online. And we subjected those ROVs to terrible pressure and put them down to the USS Yorktown and the Kaga and the Akagi, and did the first comprehensive archaeological surveys very slowly at that immense depth, 5,400 meters, which is really pushing the limits of this ROV technology. It was amazing. But he is involved in this new publication, which is a collaboration with a number of different other groups, as you can see, including the Ocean Foundation, Lloyd's Register, etc., the International Committee, ICOMOS, to get a global perspective on this issue. And what they're proposing is a series of workshops coming up soon, first one in April 2024, on potentially polluting wrecks, to begin to develop international standards of how to locate, assess, and make recommendations to mitigate or remove or partially remove the threat. And I think this is the first time that anyone started strategically addressing this issue at that level. They announced this, among other places, at the Jakarta workshop in Indonesia, where the threat is so imminent, and then said, but we have to apologize because all 3 of these meetings will be in Europe. That's okay. We understand. Can't have them everywhere, but I'm happy that it's happening. And I think that really is a change of level of effort in addressing this issue, because it's a very complex issue. As an example of that, the Sven van Helst, who is also presenting at the Jakarta conference, addressed not just the fuel oils, but the anti-fouling paints, the various other chemicals, solid metals, and ordnance that is going to be part and parcel of these World War II shipwrecks at the conference. And so I found that very intriguing. And this is, of course, his slide, credit to him, from the presentations. And had very interesting things to say about a test project area they were doing in Europe, in the Baltic, I believe, studying munitions and chemical footprint of munitions on board some of these wrecks. And I didn't know about this. He was using what he called passive environmental sensors to study the chemical footprint. Those are bags of mussels that he's putting on the wrecks. And he just takes the live mussels down there. They filter the water for a while, and then he brings them back and they accumulate that footprint. I thought, genius. That's remarkable. This is one of these new ideas that, could really take hold. So I thought that was amazing.
Do they barbecue the oysters afterwards, or do they get them, keep them alive and drop them in again?
I wish, I guess that would depend on how much they had sensed and taken into the environment, right? I don't know. I don't think we forgot to ask him that one, what they did with the samples. So I thought that was fascinating. I don't think we've done anything like that in our waters. But getting back to our waters, our Hawaiian waters, here is something that I've always kind of tried to keep on the table, because for the next few years in the Pacific, we will have both the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer, which sails for our Ocean Exploration Office. I work for the Sanctuaries Office. We have different offices within NOAA. So Okeanos Explorer has deep ocean capacity to explore and understand the biology and geology and archaeology of US waters. and has an ROV system capable of 6,000 meters. And they do live telepresence surveys if you've caught any of those online. And Okeanos will be in the Pacific for the next few years, as will Nautilus, Bob Ballard's ship with Ocean Exploration Trust. And so we get to propose to both of those places ideas that we compile from our international colleagues and amongst ourselves. And I'm always pitching the Neches here, a tanker that was torpedoed in World War II, somewhere south of Hawaii. It would be wonderful to locate the Neches and do an assessment of the potential oil spill that could happen in our waters. It's deep, you know, it's thousands of meters, and so that means it's not yeah, it's not going to be 15,000 feet. It's pretty deep. It's not going to be easily found in the usual methods of using towed sonar or multi-beam hull-mounted sonar from a ship. You're not going to see something even as large as an aircraft carrier or tanker. You need an autonomous underwater vehicle, a programmable autonomous vehicle that will drop to deep ocean depths, deploy its multi-beam sonar, swim a survey path, and locate the ship for the ROVs to then go down and assess it.
The Neches was in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, right? And I didn't realize it was 1919 that it was built.
Oh, yeah, the older AO tankers. And there is some other work that's happened in the past, of course. You can see another available report online, the Ordnance Reef Study that was done a number of years ago, 2007. But that's ordnance, you know, off the shore, off the reef. There were a lot of things that were dumped out there, so there was real concern at the time for folks to understand that. But, you know, related to, but not the same as the potentially polluting wreck issue. This is an ordnance issue for local waters. There have also been other studies in Hawaii done by the University of Hawaii off the south shore of Oahu, looking at the chemical ordnance dump sites. That was done a number of years ago as well. So my own studies in the future are actually going to be focused for a couple years on American Samoa, on the territory of American Samoa. So the Chehalis has been mitigated. We don't have a potentially polluting wreck I'm focusing on there per se, but we do face the issue of the footprint of military activities in the Pacific. Just from these images, you can see the number of pillboxes and defensive positions, and in fact, that line across the entrance to Pago Pago Harbor that you see on the map on the lower right is the former minefield and submarine net. And so there are things that we're interested in there as well that are sort of related to potentially polluting wrecks, but are certainly related to the remediation of undersea threats. And the ordnance disposal area in Samoa is something I'm interested in. A couple of years ago, I got to do further research at San Bruno, the National Archives, the Western Division, which is in San Bruno, California, and found the documents for the disposal of ordnance and military equipment in 1945 and post-war years from, I think it was Navy Base 145, Tutuila, Navy Base Tutuila, which is American Samoa, which was the center of the Samoan Defense Group. So when the war ended, all of the obsolete stuff they sent to Tutuila and made the call. It's either good enough to ship back to the West Coast, the United States, or it's like, it's obsolete, it's corroded, it's broken, take it offshore and jettison it. There aren't really records with positions, but it'll be something like, you know, take it out beyond the 50 fathom line, and then take it out beyond the 30 fathom. Just take it out there somewhere. So we know where they're leaving from, and we know the depth contours. But when you see the record of the material, it's really quite striking. I know this is a little small, but this is the jettison requested approval for October 13th, 1945, with thousands and thousands of rounds of mortar, hundreds of depth charges, you know, just a buildup of all this material that couldn't be left in place. So the question is, you know,
At least there's no fish up there.
yeah. Do we even know where that is? So that's one issue that I'll be involved in. So this is my last slide. So then What I'm happy to say is, for this issue of potentially polluting wrecks, that there's been some increased attention recently at the international level that is going to lead to some strategic thinking and standards, and hopefully, improved mitigation in the near future. But it's a really complicated issue because it's a multinational issue. And there are a lot of things to consider in attempting to mitigate the threat from a sunken vessel. The guidance we have now, for instance, is only marginally addressing the problem. These are examples of maritime archaeology guidance internationally. They come from UNESCO. They say, we look at all kinds of ships. Hey, some of them do have oil cargoes, be careful. Hey, some of them do have unexploded ordnance, so be careful. But that's not exactly addressing the issue of what you do about those aspects. These are concerned with the history and the archaeology. So I'm looking forward to the new guidance, if it can happen at the international level, from these meetings that are planned to start pretty soon in London and in other places as well. So that's it. That's my presentation on
Thank you, sir. Dr. Van Tilburg, and your monster at sea. Congratulations, and I know you have a I love me wall somewhere in that.
I'll build an addition.
All right, meeting adjourned.
Engineers and architects of Hawaii welcome your comments on this program and any of our recent programs. We encourage your direct participation in this community outreach. So please email us your comments and ideas at eahawaii@gmail.com.